Hi, my name's David Kowalik from Godwit Ministries, and today we're going to continue our series on the flesh and spirit, and we're going to be looking at the upside down logic of the spirit, how it's counterintuitive to everything that we would normally instinctively imagine. Now, before we get started, if you're enjoying this content and finding it helpful, can you please like and subscribe? That will really help us. It will also help other people to get this message. It'll get spread more widely. So thank you for doing that. Okay, well, let's get into it. Now, here's an interesting thing. As you're watching these images on whatever device you're using to watch them, the light that is going to your eye is being translated by your lens onto your retina, and it's actually upside down. Now, to counteract this, your brain has learned to rotate the image in your mind so that you think everything right way up. So apparently, if you were given special glasses that reverse the image, it would immediately appear to be upside down, at least in your mind. However, if you were to keep on wearing the glasses that turns everything upside down, your brain would eventually learn to re-see everything right way up. And this is a little bit like the way of the Spirit. When we first see the world through the Spirit, everything looks upside down, and it can take time to appreciate that you're really seeing everything authentically the right way up for the first time in your life. Now, there's a fascinating story in the Old Testament in Genesis 48, 1-22, concerning Jacob and his son Joseph, which underscores this point perfectly. In it, we discover Joseph is taking his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, to Jacob to be blessed by him. Now, this blessing was an established rite of passage that bestowed wealth and privileges upon the next generation in much the same way as a last will and testament does today. Now, the greater portion of the blessing was traditionally given to the oldest son and would therefore symbolically be conveyed by the right hand of the elder. So, as you would expect, Joseph presented his older son, Manasseh, before Jacob's right hand, and Ephraim, the younger, before the left hand. But Jacob reached out his hands and he crossed his arms and he put the greater blessing on the younger son in direct contradiction to the tradition. Now, when Joseph saw this, he was incensed and he tried to intervene, and he took hold of Jacob's arms in an attempt to reverse them. But Jacob knew exactly what he was doing, and he said to Joseph, "I know, my son, I know. He, the older son too, will become a people, and he too will become great. Nevertheless, the younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a group of nations." And that's all recorded in verse 19. Now, here we see that Jacob is up to his usual mischief. But Jacob knew that God deliberately makes upside down choices because he had personally benefited from one of those upside down divine decisions in the past. He knew what it is to be the lesser and yet end up as the recipient of the greater blessing. Now, in the 9th chapter of Romans, Paul discusses this whole matter of divine election from an upside down perspective. You can read about that in Romans 9, 6-21. And in it, Paul refers to this very same story of God choosing Jacob, the younger brother, over Esau, the older brother, as an example of the counterintuitive nature of God's choices. He notes that Jacob was chosen even before he was born, even before he had done anything, good or bad, in order that God's purpose in election might stand not by works, but by him who calls. Again, Romans 9, 11-12. In other words, God chooses the lesser of the brothers, even before they had any record of merit, to make the point that it does not therefore depend on man's desire or effort, but on God's mercy. Verse 16. I like the way the Message translation puts it. And it puts it this way, and I quote, "Compassion does not originate in our bleeding hearts or moral sweat, but in God's mercy. I'm in charge of mercy. I'm in charge of compassion." Again, that's verses 15-16 in the Message translation. This all points to the truth that God's purpose in election is not so much concerned with personal and individual salvation as it is with God's choice of who will bear testimony and witness to the promise that is made to Abraham in a way that will demonstrate that mercy has everything to do with God's faithfulness and nothing to do with human merit. Unfortunately, this same passage is often cited, wrongly I believe, to bolster an argument for a cold, hard-edged predetermination by God concerning which individuals will ultimately be saved and which will be damned. But this is not the tone or the intent of this passage at all. What Paul is attempting to do here is to make it perfectly clear that God's mercy is utterly free and cannot be constrained or influenced by human will in order that, and I quote again, God's purpose in election might stand, end quote, entirely on the basis of grace. So not only does Paul reveal how God's choice cannot be positively influenced by our merit, he also goes on to illustrate that it cannot be negatively affected by someone standing against his choice, even by someone as powerful as, say, Pharaoh. Paul draws on the story of God hardening the heart of Pharaoh to demonstrate even the most resolute resistance cannot stand in the way of God's election of the descendants of Jacob as the messengers of God's free mercy. You can read about that all in Romans 9:15-18. Now, this passage is also erroneously employed to support an argument for so-called double predestination. That is, that some are divinely predestined for salvation while others are fated for damnation. But again, this is not the intention of this passage. Now, doubtless we could be diverted by a long discussion about predestination, and I will do another video on this subject in the near future. The point here is that the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham is entirely out of human hands. Positively or negatively, human merit cannot channel the mercy of God, bending and dictating where it will flow, and just as importantly, human opposition cannot stop the mercy of God, blocking and checking where it will go. So God is sovereign in the sense that he is utterly free from outside influence concerning his mercy, and nothing and nobody can change that. This does not mean that God is micromanaging everything and everybody. It simply illustrates that nothing and nobody manages God. Therefore, when God decides to display his mercy in the descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, it has nothing to do with the good qualities of those he has chosen. Correspondingly, anyone foolish enough to stand against God's decision will soon discover it is impossible to contradict his choice. So God's sovereignty in regard to mercy is entirely free of human opposition or interference. Therefore, what we see is that God purposefully and continuously chooses messengers of his promise who could be classified as the lesser, the last, the least, the unlikely, to underscore the utterly free nature of his promise. So God's election for this purpose is therefore upside down. As recorded by Moses, the Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your ancestors that he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh and the king of Egypt. That verse is recorded in Deuteronomy 7:7-8. Now again, the emphasis here is entirely upon the greatness of God's faithfulness rather than the greatness of the people that he chose. Now the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Romans, Romans 9:25, in the Message translation, puts it this way, and I quote, Hosea put it well. I'll call nobodies and make them somebodies. I'll call the unloved and I'll make them beloved. Then we go on in verse 26. In the place where they yelled out, you're nobody, they're calling you God's living children, end quote. When rightly understood, election is not meant to indicate that the promise made to Abraham is strictly limited to an exclusive clique of fortunate souls chosen by God for salvation over and against everyone else. Nor does it mean that God is somehow hostile to those who are not chosen for the task of bearing witness to the promise. Esau, for instance, was not fated to be condemned. He was simply not chosen to be the conveyor of the message. Both the ones chosen and the ones overlooked are blessed in different ways. What's happening here is that God, in his wisdom, elects those who have the least merit in the eyes of the world to representatively bear testimony to the essential nature of God's mercy and faithfulness in relation to his promise. So, getting back to Jacob, we see that even though he was the younger brother, and despite his scheming and backstabbing and deceit, he was still chosen by God to be the one who would continue the line of Abraham. If anything, the shortcomings of Jacob show off the mercy of God in even starker relief. You know, it's amazing to me that one of God's most prominent and self-designated titles is, I am the God of Jacob. You can read about that, say, for example, in Exodus 3 verse 6 or verse 15, Matthew 22 and verse 32. So God wants the world to know that if he can be the God of someone like Jacob, then he can certainly be the God of someone like you or me, no matter who we are or what we've done in the past. And that's the point of divine election. It's making it very clear that God's choice is God's choice, not ours. This is a consistent truth through the entire Bible. Take, for instance, the people who are mentioned in the 11th chapter of Hebrews. This chapter is often put forward as an exemplary list of the sort of people we should aspire to be like. But if you take a long, hard look at this list, you'll soon discover it's not necessarily populated by the best and fairest in the land. Instead, you'll discover a motley assemblage of way less than perfect people. It includes, for instance, drunkards, murderers, adulterers, prostitutes, thieves, kidnappers, liars, and cowards. Clearly, the purpose of this list is not to underscore the virtues of those that believe, but rather to draw attention to the graciousness of the God in whom they believe. We can take courage from the fact that the so-called Hall of Fame list of the faithful were not saved by their own goodness, but by the goodness of the one in whom they believed. And Paul continues in this same vein in the first letter to the Corinthian church, where he writes, and I quote, "Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were first called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of this world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things, the things that are not, to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him." You can read about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 to 29. That goes absolutely against the grain of human wisdom. So Paul, of all people, knew exactly what he was talking about, for he recognized that he was one such person himself, declaring himself to be, and I quote, "least of all the apostles because he was a persecutor of the church." 1 Corinthians 15:10. Yet this did not stop God from using him as the most significant writer of the New Testament. Thus Paul could write in his second letter to the Corinthians, and I quote again, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and it's not from us." 2 Corinthians 4 verse 7. Now, of course, the jar of clay that he's speaking of here is the way less than perfect lives of those who are chosen to carry this treasure, the gospel, to the world. Once again, this draws attention to the faithfulness of God rather than to the bearer of the message. However, sometimes God seems to choose people who, at first glance at least, seem like they are made of the right stuff. People who are dedicated and devout and get things done for the kingdom of God. And of course, I'm thinking of someone like the Apostle Peter. He's the kind of person who I imagine would have been easy to like. A natural leader, outgoing, talented, passionate, committed to the mission of Jesus, and he threw himself into every project with enthusiasm, even to the point of being self-congratulatory. However, on the evening before the crucifixion, Jesus warned Peter and the other disciples that they were about to be tested and that they would all fail the test and that they would abandon Jesus in his hour of need. You can read about that in Matthew 26:31-35. But Peter protests profusely, saying, "Even if all these other snowflakes melt away, I never will." To which Jesus comes back and says to Peter, "Peter, before the next dawn, you're going to deny me 3 times. As a little side note, anything done 3 times is kind of a big deal in Jewish culture. Once would be a forgivable mistake, twice would be a terrible disloyalty, but 3 times is a flat-out betrayal. Yet Peter defended his loyalty, saying, "Even if I have to face death for you, I would never disown you." In Luke's account of this same story, Jesus warns Peter that Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. Now, sifting wheat is a way of measuring the quality of the wheat. It's a way of separating the chaff from the grain. But Peter seemed to almost welcome the test, effectively saying, "Bring it on. You won't find any chaff here. I'm wheat all the way to the core. Jesus, you can rely on me, even if prison or death are on the line." You can read about that in Luke 22, verse 33. Now, of course, we all know what happened a few short hours later as Peter emphatically betrayed Jesus with his 3 times denial. When Peter realized what he had done, he was overcome with grief and remorse, and he wept bitterly. Luke 22:62. After the resurrection, Peter was a broken man, and he was convinced that his failure had completely disqualified him from service for Jesus forever. After years of being right in the middle of the messianic mission, he was now deliberately standing aside. He had been weighed, he'd been measured, and he'd been found wanting. So he went back to his old trade of fishing. At least that was something he knew how to do. But his first fishing foray was fruitless, even after fishing all night. Someone on the beach called out to Peter and the others with him, saying, "Friends, have you caught any fish?" This is in John 21, verse 5. "No," they answered, as if rubbing salt into the wound of their failure. But the man on the beach insisted that they throw their nets one more time on the right side of the boat. And when they did, they were unable to haul in the nets because of the large number of fish that they had snared. Verse 6. Suddenly Peter realizes who it is standing on the beach. Of course, it was Jesus. And Peter was so thrilled that he immediately leapt into the water and swam ashore to greet Jesus. So clearly, Peter still loved Jesus, but his betrayal hung heavy on his heart. A little later, after they had all eaten, Jesus engaged Peter in conversation, asking him, "Peter, do you love me?" To which Peter responded, well, something along the lines of the following loose interpretation of the original text: "Lord, you know I have the deepest affection for you, but love you?" I think we all know the answer to that question. And to this, Jesus replies, "Nevertheless, I'm calling you to feed my lambs." And again, Jesus asked Peter, "Do you love me?" To which Peter once more responds, "Lord, you know how I feel about you. I hold you in the highest regard, but I know you must be deeply disappointed in me." But Jesus repeats his appeal to Peter, "Care for my sheep." And a third time, Jesus asked Peter, "Do you love me?" By now, Peter was feeling disheartened. And he replied saying, "Lord, you know me inside and out. You must know how much I care about you, but you must also know I just don't have what it takes to serve you." Sure, this is a loose translation, but I think it gets to the spirit of what's going on here. Yet Jesus reaffirms his calling to Peter, saying, "Peter, feed my sheep." This is verse 15-17. Jesus has effectively cancelled out Peter's threefold denial with his threefold reinstatement. And then Jesus says the most remarkable thing. He says, "Truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself, and you went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." John 21:18-19. Jesus was bringing Peter into a new understanding. What he is effectively saying is this: in your youth, you were self-reliant, a self-made man who did what he willed whenever he wanted. But the time has come for you to learn how to be led and to go where you are guided. Now, Peter was truly ready to follow Jesus. And it comes as no surprise then that the Peter we meet in the book of the Acts is quite different to the Peter we know in the Gospels. Take for instance the account of Peter and John as they were on their way to the temple to pray, recorded in Acts chapter 3, when they had a chance encounter with a certain crippled man begging for money. Now Peter looked at the man and he confessed that he had no money, but he did have something far better, and he commanded the man to be healed in the name of Jesus. So that's Acts chapter 3, verses 1 to 10. Now, naturally, when all the local people began to realize what had happened, they came running to Peter and to John in astonishment at what they had accomplished. When Peter saw this, he said to them, "Fellow Israelites, why does this surprise you? Why do you stare at us as if by our own power or godliness we made this man walk? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, has glorified his servant Jesus." So that whole story is Acts 3, 12 to 13. See, now Peter is fully aware that this remarkable event had nothing to do with his own power or godliness, and everything to do with the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Put in other words, Peter was saying that this miracle is beyond the power of human will. This is an Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob level miracle. In the same way that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the genesis of a whole new miraculous family, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is also the God of Peter and Paul, and of you and of me. And the cause of this all-surpassing power is God. It's certainly not from us. What this tells us is that God's grace is wild and untamable, and that every divine blessing is freely given, and we can never control it or acquire it or do something to get it. It can only be received as a gift from the hand of God. Thus, we cannot claim that our own power or godliness, or any other virtue for that matter, enabled us to choose salvation. So to claim that we have chosen God is to claim that we somehow have a hand in our own salvation. But that choice is simply outside of our capacity. The only choice that's left to us is either to receive him or to refuse him, but we certainly cannot choose him. There is a world of difference between getting something from God and receiving something from him. And this is the difference that delineates the border between flesh and spirit. And as we've seen in the past, between Cain and Abel, and Ishmael and Isaac. And now we're talking about the difference between Esau and Jacob. If we were not received the blessing, then we've refused it. And one of the most effective ways that we can refuse God is by relying on our own power or godliness, or if you like, on the flesh. Again, this underscores the truth and the difference between the power of the flesh and the power of the Spirit. Choose life.